Why the NBA is terrified of the Cleveland Cavaliers. After acquiring Donovan Mitchel last season and adding him to an otherwise extremely talented young roster, a lot of people were extremely excited to see what the Cavs can do last season. And although they were able to make the playoffs and people had pretty high expectations for them, they ended up losing relatively easily in the first round to the New York Knicks. And although last season was certainly a failure for the Cavs, I'm here to tell you that the NBA is still terrified of this Cleveland team. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports. I make opinionated NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. The Cleveland Cavaliers have had a very interesting history. They were a team that had a ton of success when they had LeBron James, but on the same token, they were also a team that struggled tremendously for a really long time when they didn't have LeBron on their roster. But over the more recent history, ever since LeBron left the Cavs the second time, they've been a team that's been building through the draft and building through their young players that they already had on their roster, and slowly season after season, we've been seeing more and more success. And it got to the point where last season, they were able to acquire an extremely talented player in Donovan Mitchel to add to this otherwise young and talented roster. And originally when the Cavs acquired Donovan during last offseason, people had extremely high expectations for this team. Although people didn't necessarily expect them to win the championship in their first season, people definitely expected them to make it far in the playoffs. But unfortunately, as I mentioned before in the video, although the Cavs were able to make it to the playoffs, and they did play relatively well during the regular season, they ended up basically getting starched by the New York Knicks in the first round, which was certainly something most Cavs fans did not see coming, and most NBA fans in general didn't see coming based upon the talent they have on the roster. But although the Cavs certainly did struggle tremendously last season during the playoffs specifically, I'm here to tell you that the NBA is still terrified of this Cavs team. But the question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why do I feel that way? Why do I feel like after such a disappointing season last year, the NBA is still terrified of this Cleveland Cavaliers team? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor that I want to touch upon is the overall talent on this roster. Now, when you look at this roster from top to bottom, it's pretty clear that this is an extremely talented young roster. They have guys like Donovan Mitchel, who's a proven star in the NBA. They have guys like Darius Garland, who's an up-and-coming point guard in the league, and in my opinion, he's a guy who's going to be a really good player in the future. They also have Evan Mobley, who I feel very similarly about. I think he's a young player that's already very good at this point, but he's only going to get better with time, and I think he is one of those guys that's just a special talent out there. But even besides that, they have Jared Allen, who's an extremely efficient and effective big. They have other really nice young players like Isaac Okoro, who's a really great defender and is also a guy who's working on his offensive game. Caris LeVert is another guy on the roster that's a pretty young, talented player, and is also a guy that has a capability to put up 30 plus points on any given night. He has that kind of special offensive talent. But even besides him, they have a guy in Ricky Rubio who serves as a really good point guard for them as a backup point guard, but also serves as a veteran presence in that locker room, which is very valuable to a young roster. And all those players that I just mentioned were on the roster last year, but during this offseason, the Cavs did a really nice job at even adding more talent to this otherwise very talented young roster. Like, for example, a guy in Emoni Bates, who although didn't necessarily have the best college career, was a guy who was seen to have all the talent in the world coming out of high school. But even besides him, they were able to add Max Strus, who's definitely going to be a legitimate part of this rotation, and they were also able to add other players like Isaiah Mobley, Ty Jerome, and some others as well. But more specifically, Max Strus and Emoni Bates, in my opinion, are probably going to be legitimate contributors to this Cleveland Cavaliers rotation. So adding more talent to this otherwise very talented young roster is just going to make this team that much more dangerous, and is a huge reason for why I think the NBA is still at this point terrified of this Cleveland Cavaliers team going into this next year. But the next reason that I want to touch upon for why I feel as if the NBA is still terrified of this Cavs team is due to the overall experience they gained last year. Because not only was last year the first time that a lot of these players were playing with Donovan Mitchell in the playoffs, but also last year was the first time that a lot of these players made the playoffs in general. So in my opinion, the experience they got actually helps them out in two different ways. The first way that is going to help them out, and the most obvious way, is the fact that a lot of these young guys finally got some playoff experience last year. But the next reason why I think the experience they had last year is going to help them going forward is due to the fact that they're learning how to play with Donovan Mitchell in the playoffs. Because whenever you add a player of the caliber of Donovan Mitchell, there's always going to be somewhat of an adjustment period during the regular season, but more specifically during the playoffs. Because when you add a player of the caliber of Donovan, he's going to be a guy that has the ball in his hands a lot of the time throughout the game. So for a lot of different players on this Cavs roster that were used to having the ball in their hands for the most part are going to need somewhat of an adjustment period to that kind of change by adding Donovan Mitchell to the roster. So I think the experience they got last year in the playoffs helps them out in a lot of different ways, and I also do think that the fact that they weren't able to have all that much success last year is just going to motivate them and put a fire under a lot of these guys, and I do think that experience and the lack of success is actually going to help them going forward from here. Now the next factor that I want to touch upon for why I feel as if the NBA is still terrified of this Cleveland Cavaliers team is due to the overall coaching. Now when you look at the Cavs coach and JB Bickerstaff, who's been there for a couple years now, he's been a guy who's had some success and has had some lack of success. But I do think the experience that he learned from last year, not only during the regular season, but also some of their struggles in the playoffs, are going to be something that motivates him and is going to be something he makes adjustments to. Because now the Cavs coaching staff knows the mistakes they made last year during the playoffs more specifically, and can do a lot of different things to fix those issues. Because the biggest thing about coaching, to me at least, isn't necessarily being successful on your first run, but after you make some mistakes, the biggest thing to me is to see how the coaches adjust from there. And I really do think JB is going to make some nice adjustments for this Cavs roster that's going to make them better not only during the regular season, but more importantly during the playoffs as well. But overall, due to a lot of the different factors that I mentioned in this video, I really do feel as if the Cavs are going to be a significantly better team this upcoming season than they were last year, and they're going to be a lot closer to the expectations they had going into last season. I just think, talking about Donovan Mitchell specifically, he's going to play very well during the regular season like he always does, but going into next year's playoffs, assuming the Cavs do make it there, which I fully expect them to do, I think he's going to have a much better playoffs, especially considering that he played so poorly in last year's. And I think based upon that one factor alone, it's going to make the Cavs a much better team in the playoffs. Because if the best player on your team is playing like the best player on your team in the playoffs, that just gives everybody else so much more of a boost to make them play better, but also of course helps your team actually win games in the playoffs. But I guess only time will tell what does end up happening for the Cleveland Cavaliers, not only during this next season, but also in the long-term future. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Cleveland Cavaliers are actually a team that the NBA is afraid of during this upcoming season, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.